Cedar Valley, a small town where tensions simmer between the police department and the community it's sworn to protect. But when a new police chief, Nathaniel Nate Carter, steps into the precinct, he isn't looking for an easy ride, he's there to make a difference. On his very first day, Chief Carter goes undercover to see the truth of his department unfiltered. What he discovers, a toxic culture and a shocking act of disrespect, sets the stage for a battle that will test his leadership, his resolve, and his vision for change. As the story unfolds, you'll see betrayal from within, defiance from a disgraced officer, and the spark of a community finally being heard. Can one man bring justice to a broken system? Or will the weight of the past prove too heavy to overcome? Stay tuned as we unravel a journey of accountability, redemption, and hope that will leave you questioning what true leadership really looks like. If you're ready for a story that blends tension, triumph, and transformation, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, what does real change mean to you? Let's begin. The sun hung low over Cedar Valley, painting the early morning sky in hues of amber and pink. Nathaniel Nate Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his aging sedan as he pulled into the precinct's parking lot. This wasn't his first assignment as a police chief, but it was his most critical. Cedar Valley's department was a sore spot in the region, plagued by allegations of bias, misconduct, and a disconnect from the community it was sworn to protect. Nate had been deliberate about his entrance. Dressed in faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and worn sneakers, he didn't look the part of a man who had risen through the ranks of law enforcement with an impeccable record. His decision to come in plain clothes wasn't without risk, but Nate believed in seeing things as they were, not as people wanted him to see them. The lot bustled with activity as officers exchanged morning greetings. Nate scanned the area, his eyes catching snippets of conversations. A few glanced his way, curiosity flickering briefly before they returned to their routines. No one recognized him, and that was just how he wanted it. With a deep breath, he adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and walked toward the building's side entrance. The air smelled faintly of coffee and exhaust, a familiar scent that tugged at memories of his early years on the force. He clenched his jaw, pushing back the weight of expectations. This was just the beginning. The side entrance opened into a narrow hallway lined with faded posters reminding officers of their duty to protect and serve. Nate's footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor as he made his way toward the break room. Laughter and casual banter spilled into the corridor, punctuated by the occasional clang of a coffee pot. "Hey, you!" The sharp voice stopped Nate in his tracks. He turned slowly, locking eyes with a stocky man in his late 30s. The officer's badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Fuller. Derek Fuller strode toward him, his grin more mocking than friendly. A group of officers leaned against a nearby wall, their interest piqued. "You lost or something?" Derek asked, folding his arms across his chest. "No, just..." "Wait a second." Derek squinted at Nate, his expression hardening. "This isn't a shelter, buddy. You looking for handouts? You're in the wrong place." Nate's breath hitched. He'd dealt with officers like Derek before, men who wore their authority like armor and used it as a weapon. Didn't you hear me?" Derek interrupted, stepping closer. "Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." The laughter behind him grew louder. Nate's fingers curled into a fist, but he forced himself to relax. He wouldn't let this moment define him or the changes he planned to bring. Without warning, Derek spat, the warm saliva striking Nate's cheek. The room erupted in laughter. Nate's vision blurred as the humiliation settled over him, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his face with slow, deliberate movements. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but firm. "Only the ones who don't belong here," Derek replied, his smirk widening. Nate said nothing more. He turned and walked away, the laughter fading behind him as he made his way toward the precinct's main office. The briefing room buzzed with chatter as officers gathered, coffee mugs in hand and conversations flowing freely. At the front of the room, Captain Walter Brennan, a graying man with a no-nonsense demeanor, called for order. "All right, everyone, settle down," Brennan said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We got an important introduction today." Nate stepped into the room from a side door, now dressed in a tailored suit and holding a leather folder embossed with the precinct's emblem. The room stilled as his presence registered. Whispers rippled through the crowd, curiosity giving way to recognition. Brennan cleared his throat. "As most of you know, Chief Anderson retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce Nathaniel Carter as Cedar Valley's new chief of police." Nate's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Derek. The officer's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. Nate took his time approaching the podium, his footsteps measured and deliberate. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "As Captain Brennan mentioned, my name is Nathaniel Carter. As of today, I am your new chief." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I came in this morning in plain clothes," Nate continued, his tone calm but edged with steel. "I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. And what I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur spread through the room, but Nate raised a hand, silencing it. "In my brief time here, I've seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but unacceptable. Let me be clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." His words cut through the silence like a blade. Derek shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Nate's gaze. "Respect," Nate said, leaning slightly forward, "is not optional. It's the foundation of everything we do. Without it, we fail not just each other, but the community we swore to protect." He straightened, his eyes scanning the room once more. "This morning, I was treated like someone who didn't matter. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." The tension in the room was palpable. Nate let the silence linger before stepping away from the podium. "Captain Brennan," he said, his voice carrying an air of finality, "please ensure Officer Fuller meets me in my office after this meeting." Nate's office was sparse but orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. Derek entered hesitantly, his bravado replaced by a palpable unease. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's the problem," Nate interrupted, his tone sharp. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You acted on assumptions, and in doing so, you disrespected the badge, this department, and the community we serve." Derek stammered, but Nate held up a hand. "I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. This is not a punishment. It's a chance for you to reflect. If you think you can do better, prove it. If not, this is not the place for you." Derek left, his face flushed with humiliation. Nate exhaled deeply, knowing the road ahead would be long. But he was ready. By mid-morning, whispers about the confrontation in the briefing room had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officers passed each other in the hall with furtive glances, their usual camaraderie replaced by an air of tension. Some tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Things were different now. In his office, Nate reviewed a mountain of files. Each document painted a picture of a department steeped in bad habits. Complaints of excessive force, poor community relations, and internal harassment dotted the reports, most of which had been quietly dismissed or ignored. It was a lot to unpack, but Nate was no stranger to uphill battles. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Captain Walter Brennan, his expression a mix of wariness and curiosity. "Got a minute, Chief?" Brennan asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. "Always," Nate replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Brennan sat, his fingers drumming on the armrests. "I've been with this department for 20 years, he began, his tone measured. "I've seen chiefs come and go, each with their own ideas about how things should run." "And?" Nate prompted, leaning back in his chair. Brennan sighed. "And you've stirred the pot more in a morning than most manage in a year. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you should know change doesn't sit well with everyone here." "I didn't come here to make friends, Captain," Nate said evenly. "I came to fix what's broken." Brennan nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just know that Fuller and his crew, they won't take this lying down. And if you're planning to dig into their records, you're bound to uncover things that some folks would rather keep buried." "That's exactly the point," Nate said, his voice firm. This department can't rebuild trust with the community if we're afraid of what we might find. Brennan stood, his gaze steady. Then I hope you've got thick skin, Chief. You'll need it. That evening, Nate decided to take a walk through Cedar Valley's downtown district. The streets were lively, with families enjoying the last days of summer. Children darted between storefronts, their laughter a sharp contrast to the weight Nate carried. As he strolled, he noticed the occasional wary glance from passersby. The community's relationship with its police force had clearly been strained for years. He couldn't blame them. Mistrust didn't grow overnight, and it wouldn't disappear quickly either. Outside a small diner, Nate paused. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Community meeting. Concerns about the police department. All welcome." Inside, a group of locals had gathered, their voices a mix of frustration and exhaustion. At the center of the discussion was a woman in her early 30s, her presence commanding but approachable. "My name is Vanessa Green," she said, addressing the group. "And I'm tired of feeling like we don't matter to the people who are supposed to protect us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Nate lingered near the doorway, listening. "It's not just about the big things," Vanessa continued. "It's the little things too. The way they look at us, the way they talk to us like we're the enemy. That's what has to change." Nate felt a pang of recognition. Vanessa wasn't just describing her experiences. She was echoing the very reasons he'd become a police officer a decade ago. When the meeting ended, Nate approached her. "Vanessa Green," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Nate Carter, the new police chief." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she shook his hand. "You've got a lot of work to do, Chief." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." The next morning, Nate arrived at the precinct before dawn. The halls were empty, the silence broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. He made his way to the briefing room, flipping on the projector. A presentation titled "Rebuilding Trust, A Plan for Change" filled the screen. By the time the first officers trickled in, Nate was ready. He stood at the podium, his expression calm but determined. "Good morning," he began. "Today we're going to talk about where we go from here." The presentation was thorough, outlining a three-phase approach to reform. It included mandatory community engagement, enhanced training on de-escalation techniques, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. As Nate spoke, he watched the officers' reactions. Some nodded in agreement, while others folded their arms, their skepticism clear. Derek Fuller, sitting in the back row, wore a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. When Nate finished, he opened the floor for questions. "This all sounds nice on paper," one officer said, his tone clipped. "But what makes you think things will actually change?" "Because they have to," Nate replied. "If this department doesn't evolve, it will collapse. And I'm not here to watch it fall." The room was silent for a moment before Captain Brennan stood. "For what it's worth," Brennan said, "I've seen a lot of plans come through here, but this one feels different. I think we owe it to ourselves and the community to give it a shot." Nate met Brennan's gaze and nodded. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. Over the next week, Nate began implementing his reforms. He walked the halls regularly, taking the time to speak with each officer individually. Some were receptive, while others remained guarded. In one conversation, Officer Emily Harrington, a relatively new recruit, confided her frustrations. "I joined this department because I wanted to make a difference," she said. "But it's hard when you feel like you're swimming against the tide." "You're not alone, Emily," Nate assured her. "Change takes time, but it starts with people like you." Meanwhile, Nate met with community leaders, including Vanessa Green. Their discussions were candid and, at times, tense, but they shared a common goal: repairing the fractured relationship between the police and the town. As progress slowly unfolded, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Derek Fuller and his allies began undermining Nate's efforts, spreading rumors and subtly encouraging insubordination. But Nate remained steadfast. Every small victory, a supportive comment from a community member, a constructive suggestion from an officer bolstered his resolve. Late one evening, Nate sat alone in his office, reviewing the day's reports. His phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Saw Harrington out on patrol today. She stopped to chat with a group of kids. It made a difference." Nate smiled, The message a reminder of why he'd taken this job. Change wouldn't come easily, but moments like this proved it was possible. As he leaned back in his chair, the precinct's hallway echoed with the faint sound of laughter. For the first time since his arrival, it wasn't at anyone's expense. Nate allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight there was hope. The days following Nate's initial reforms saw both progress and resistance. As he walked the precinct each morning, he greeted officers by name, a practice that felt foreign in a workplace long governed by hierarchy and unspoken cliques. "You're really doubling down, huh, Chief?" Officer Emily Harrington remarked one morning as she passed Nate in the hallway. "It's not doubling down," Nate replied with a small smile. "It's called consistency." Emily chuckled, but didn't argue. Among the younger recruits, she was becoming a quiet ally. Her willingness to engage with both Nate and the community stood out, though it didn't go unnoticed by the more entrenched members of the department. But Nate was aware that change, however slight, wasn't coming without a price. He could feel the tension building, especially when Derek Fuller entered a room. Fuller's smirk had faded, replaced by a simmering resentment that Nate suspected would boil over sooner rather than later. One Friday afternoon, Cedar Valley held its monthly Open Door Friday, a community initiative aimed at fostering transparency between law enforcement and residents. Nate attended in full uniform for the first time, standing alongside officers who looked as uncomfortable as the townspeople did. Halfway through the event, a man in his 60s approached Nate. His name was Robert Atkins, a retired schoolteacher whose frustration had long bubbled just beneath the surface. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Chief," Atkins began, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "But how do we trust a department that protects officers like Derek Fuller?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Nate didn't flinch. "I won't defend the mistakes of the past," Nate said, meeting Atkins' gaze. "But I will hold this department accountable for the future." Atkins didn't seem entirely satisfied, but before he could respond, Fuller appeared, his expression tight. "That's enough," Fuller said, stepping forward. "We're here to listen, not to be attacked." Nate raised a hand, signaling for calm. "This isn't an attack, Officer Fuller. It's accountability." Fuller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. As Atkins walked away, Nate could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If his officers couldn't embrace the changes, how could the community? Back at the precinct, the fallout from the event was immediate. Nate called a meeting with his senior staff to address the growing tension, but the division within the department became painfully clear. Captain Walter Brennan sat at one end of the table, his arms crossed. Beside him, Officer Rebecca Grant, a 15-year veteran, looked skeptical. Emily Harrington, sitting to Nate's right, appeared nervous but resolute. "This isn't working," Grant said bluntly. "You're asking us to throw out years of tradition overnight." "I'm asking you to adapt," Nate replied, his tone calm but firm. "Tradition doesn't mean much if it's hurting the people we're supposed to protect." Brennan sighed. "Look, Chief, I see what you're trying to do, and I respect it. But you've got officers like Fuller who've been here longer than most of us. They don't take kindly to being told they're the problem. Then maybe they need to ask themselves why they feel targeted," Nate said. The room fell silent. The meeting ended without resolution, but as the officers filed out, Emily lingered behind. "You're not going to back down, are you?" she asked. "Not for a second," Nate replied. The following week, the tension came to a head during a routine patrol. Derek Fuller and another officer, Mike Daniels, responded to a minor noise complaint in one of Cedar Valley's predominantly black neighborhoods. By the time Nate arrived at the scene, called there by a concerned resident, what should have been a simple conversation had turned into a shouting match. Fuller stood with his arms crossed, glaring at a young man who looked no older than 18. "What's going on here?" Nate asked, stepping between Fuller and the young man. "Disrespectful punk doesn't want to cooperate," Fuller snapped. The young man's mother stepped forward, her voice shaking. "My son didn't do anything wrong. He was just sitting on our porch." Nate turned to the young man. "What's your name?" "Jamal," he said quietly. "Jamal, did you say anything to these officers?" "I told them I live here," Jamal replied. "That's it." Nate nodded. "And that's all you needed to say?" He turned back to Fuller. "We're done here. Go back to the precinct. Fuller's eyes narrowed. Are you kidding me? I said we're done. Nate repeated, his voice like steel. Reluctantly, Fuller and Daniels left. Nate stayed behind, apologizing to Jamal and his mother. As he walked back to his car, he knew this wasn't the end of the matter. Back at the precinct, Nate initiated an internal review of Fuller's conduct, pulling records of his past complaints. What he found wasn't surprising, but was deeply troubling: multiple allegations of excessive force and racial bias, all quietly dismissed by previous leadership. He brought the findings to Captain Brennan. This has been going on for years, Nate said, dropping the file onto Brennan's desk. Brennan looked through the file, his expression grim. And you're planning to bring this to the board? I don't have a choice, Nate replied. This department can't afford to sweep things under the rug anymore. Brennan leaned back in his chair. You know this is going to blow everything wide open, right? Good, Nate said. The next morning, Nate found a note taped to his office door. Mind your business, Chief. He crumpled the note without a second thought, but the message was clear: Fuller's allies were pushing back. In the days that followed, rumors spread throughout the precinct. Nate heard whispers accusing him of favoritism, of trying to dismantle the department for personal gain. Emily Harrington noticed the shift too. They're trying to turn people against you, she said one afternoon. They can try, Nate replied, but the truth speaks louder than rumors. At the end of the week, the internal board reviewed Fuller's record and approved his suspension, pending further investigation. It wasn't the sweeping change Nate hoped for, but it was a start. That evening, Vanessa Green called him. I heard about Fuller, she said. The community's noticing, Chief. It might not seem like much, but it's a step. Nate allowed himself a brief smile. One step at a time, he said. As the precinct emptied for the night, Nate remained at his desk, poring over reports. The tension within the department was at an all-time high, but so was his resolve. He glanced out the window at the quiet streets of Cedar Valley. Change wasn't coming easily, but it was coming, and for the first time, Nate felt like he was gaining ground. The air in the precinct grew heavier by the day. Conversations quieted when Nate walked by, and certain officers, those who once sat at the center of group discussions, seemed to shrink into the corners. Yet, a handful of officers, including Emily Harrington and a soft-spoken officer named Kevin Moore, started showing cautious support for the changes Nate implemented. Still, the resistance was vocal, and not all of it was behind closed doors. Change is fine and all, grumbled Officer Rebecca Grant during a break-room discussion Nate happened to overhear. But Carter's turning this place upside down. Feels like he doesn't trust us. Nate paused just outside the door listening. Another officer chimed in. Yeah, and now Fuller's benched. You think anyone's safe from this witch hunt? Feels like we're walking on eggshells. The words stung, but Nate knew they were born from fear, not logic. He walked away without comment, determined to address the sentiment later in a formal capacity. A week later, Nate introduced a policy requiring officers to spend time patrolling on foot in their assigned neighborhoods, a movement to rebuild trust with the community. The initiative was met with mixed reactions. Emily Harrington volunteered immediately, as did Kevin Moore. Others, like Rebecca Grant and Derek Fuller's remaining allies, made their displeasure clear through grumbling and eye rolls. You expect us to just walk up and talk to strangers? Grant asked during a briefing. Yes, Nate replied simply. How else do we expect them to trust us if we don't even know their names? Later that day, Nate joined Emily on her first foot patrol in the West Cedar neighborhood. The area was predominantly Black and Hispanic, and many of the residents regarded the police with suspicion. As they walked past a small playground, a group of children stopped playing to watch them. One boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped forward hesitantly. You gonna arrest someone? He asked, his voice barely audible. Emily crouched to meet his eye level. Nope, she said with a warm smile. We're just here to say hi. What's your name? The boy hesitated before answering. Jaden. Well, Jaden, Emily said, if there's anything you ever need, you let me know, okay? Jaden nodded, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. As they walked away, Nate saw something in Emily he hadn't seen in many officers: genuine care. While some officers began to embrace the changes, others doubled down on their resistance. Derek Fuller, though suspended, still had influence. From the sidelines, he spread rumors about Nate's hidden agenda and encouraged officers to question every policy. One morning, Nate received a report from Kevin Moore about a troubling incident. A senior officer, Tom Ridley, had openly mocked the Foot Patrol initiative during a morning meeting, calling it a dog and pony show. Did anyone defend it? Nate asked Kevin. Not really, Kevin admitted. But Emily spoke up after the meeting. She called him out on it. Nate smiled faintly. Good for her. The turning point came during a routine traffic stop involving Officer Rebecca Grant. A local activist, Malik Reynolds, was pulled over for a broken taillight. By the time Nate arrived at the scene, alerted by a call from Vanessa Green, Malik was standing on the sidewalk, visibly upset, while Grant and two other officers stood nearby. What's going on here? Nate asked, his tone calm but firm. Chief, he was argumentative, Grant said defensively. I was just following protocol. Malik cut in, his voice sharp. Protocol? You treated me like a criminal for a broken taillight. Nate turned to Malik. Let's step aside and talk. The two men moved a few feet away, where Malik vented his frustration. This keeps happening, Chief. I'm tired of it. You say you want change, but it's the same story every time. Nate listened intently before responding. I can't undo what just happened, Malik. But I promise you this, I'll get to the bottom of it. Later that evening, Nate reviewed Grant's body camera footage. While there was no overt misconduct, her tone and demeanor had been unnecessarily confrontational. Nate called her into his office the next morning. Rebecca, we need to talk, he began. Rebecca Grant's conversation with Nate was civil but tense. Though she acknowledged the importance of de-escalation, she didn't fully embrace Nate's vision. I get what you're saying, Chief, she said. But some of us feel like we're being judged for doing our jobs. Doing your job means respecting the people we serve, Nate replied. If we lose that, we lose everything. Outside the office, whispers about the meeting spread quickly. Some officers saw Nate's approach as necessary, while others resented it as micromanagement. To address growing concerns, Nate organized a public forum at Cedar Valley High School. The turnout was larger than expected, with residents filling the gymnasium. Vanessa Green spoke first, recounting her experiences with the department. I've seen some small changes, she said, glancing at Nate. But we've got a long way to go. When Nate took the stage, he didn't sugarcoat the challenges. We've made mistakes, he admitted, but I'm committed to fixing them. And that starts with accountability on both sides. The crowd's response was mixed, but a few residents approached Nate afterward to thank him for his honesty. Among them was Malik Reynolds, whose earlier anger had softened. You've got a tough job, Chief, Malik said, but I'm rooting for you. Just as the tension seemed to plateau, it spiked again. Late one evening, Nate received a call about a fight breaking out near a local bar. When he arrived on the scene, he found Derek Fuller, despite his suspension, standing amidst a crowd, shouting at a group of civilians. What are you doing here, Fuller? Nate demanded, stepping between him and the crowd. Just try to keep the peace, Fuller replied smugly. You're suspended, Nate reminded him. Go home. Now. Fuller hesitated, then smirked. You're making a mistake, Carter. As Fuller walked away, Nate turned to the crowd. Everyone, please disperse. This isn't the way to solve things. The incident left Nate shaken. Fuller's defiance had gone too far, and it was clear that his influence extended beyond the precinct. Back at the precinct, Nate sat in his office, replaying the night's events in his mind. The challenges were mounting, and the path forward felt more uncertain than ever. As he looked out the window at the quiet streets of Cedar Valley, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily Harrington. Chief, she said softly, I just wanted to say I'm with you. No matter what. Nate nodded, grateful for the support. Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know. But as he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conflict settled over him. The road ahead would be long, and the stakes higher than ever. The events at the bar left Nate no choice but to escalate disciplinary measures against Derek Fuller. The next morning, Nate called an emergency meeting with Captain Brennan and the precinct's legal advisor, Susan Adler. Fuller's behavior has crossed every line imaginable, Nate said, his frustration evident. If we don't act decisively, we send a message that this department tolerates defiance and misconduct. Susan nodded. He's already under investigation for prior complaints, but his presence at the bar during suspension makes this a clear violation of policy. Termination is on the table. Brennan looked hesitant. Chief, you know how tight-knit some of these officers are. Firing Fuller will rile them up even more. Let them be riled up, Nate replied. The cost of inaction is higher than any backlash. By the end of the day, Fuller received formal notice of termination. His response was swift and furious. He stormed into the precinct, ignoring protocol, and shouted at the front desk staff until Nate confronted him in the hallway. "You're done here, Fuller," Nate said, his voice calm but firm. "Turn in your badge and leave." Fuller's face twisted in rage. "You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with." Nate didn't flinch. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. Now leave before I have you escorted out." Fuller left, but the tension he left behind lingered like a storm cloud over the precinct. The fallout from Fuller's termination was immediate. Some officers saw it as a long overdue step toward reform, while others viewed it as a betrayal. Rumors swirled that Fuller was rallying support outside the department, stirring up discontent among the community's more conservative factions. Nate doubled down on his efforts to engage with the precinct. He held small group meetings, encouraging open dialogue about their concerns. In one meeting, Officer Rebecca Grant voiced what many were thinking. "Chief, it feels like you're putting us on trial," she said. "Like we're guilty until proven innocent." Nate took a deep breath before responding. "This isn't about guilt or innocence, Rebecca. It's about trust. If we want the community to trust us, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard." Grant looked unconvinced, but Kevin Moore chimed in. "He's right. We can't ask for respect if we don't give it first." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Slowly, a few officers nodded in agreement, but Nate knew the battle for their hearts and minds was far from over. A week later, tensions boiled over in the community. A peaceful rally organized by Vanessa Green to discuss police reform turned chaotic when a group of counter-protesters allegedly emboldened by Fuller arrived to disrupt the event. Nate was on the scene with a team of officers, trying to maintain order. He stood between the two groups, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "Everyone, please disperse," he called out. "This is not the way to have your voices heard." The counter-protesters jeered, some shouting obscenities. One man stepped forward, pointing at Nate. "You're ruining this town, Carter," he yelled. "We don't need your kind here." The words hit like a slap, but Nate kept his composure. He turned to Vanessa, who stood resolute among her supporters. "We're staying peaceful," she said firmly. "I'll make sure it stays that way," Nate promised. The rally eventually dispersed without violence, but the confrontation left the community shaken. Nate knew the divide was deepening, and Fuller's influence was far from over. The next morning, Nate arrived at the precinct to find graffiti scrawled across the side of the building. "Traitor Chief." Inside, he called an emergency meeting with Captain Brennan and Susan Adler. "This isn't just external resistance," Nate said. "Someone inside this department is feeding Fuller information. We need to find out who." Susan frowned. "It won't be easy. But if you're right, this could be the break we need to sever Fuller's influence for good." As they reviewed security footage and incident reports, Emily Harrington approached Nate's office. "Chief, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him a stack of anonymous notes left in the staff lounge. Each one contained veiled threats and derogatory comments about Nate's leadership. "It's worse than I thought," Nate muttered. "We're dealing with more than just a toxic culture. This is sabotage." Late one night, Nate was called to the scene of a house fire in one of Cedar Valley's most underserved neighborhoods. When he arrived, he found Vanessa Green standing outside, her face streaked with soot and tears. "It's my brother's house," she choked out. "They threw something through the window." Nate's heart sank. This wasn't just resistance, it was an attack. He immediately ordered a full investigation, assigning Emily Harrington and Kevin Moore to lead the case. As he stood with Vanessa, watching firefighters douse the flames, she turned to him. "This is what happens when you try to change things," she said bitterly. "They don't just fight back, they destroy." Nate placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to find out who did this, and we're going to stop them." But as he drove back to the precinct that night, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The fire became a rallying cry for both sides of the divide. Community members demanded justice, while Fuller's supporters framed the investigation as an overreach of power. Nate attended another town hall meeting where tensions reached a fever pitch. "What are you doing to protect us?" a resident shouted. "We're scared to leave our homes." "I understand your fear," Nate said. "And I promise you, we're doing everything in our power to bring the perpetrators to justice." But another voice cut through the room. "And what about protecting the officers? You've turned this department into a war zone." It was Rebecca Grant. Her public defiance sent a ripple through the room, and Nate knew the trust he'd been building within the department was hanging by a thread. Despite the chaos, Emily and Kevin made progress in the arson investigation. They discovered surveillance footage showing a truck leaving the scene shortly before the fire. The vehicle was traced back to one of Fuller's known associates. When Nate confronted Fuller with the evidence, the former officer denied everything but refused to cooperate further. "You think you've won?" Fuller sneered. "You'll never change this town. People like me will always be here." Nate stared him down. "You're right about one thing, Fuller. People like you will always exist. But people like me will always fight to stop you." Nate returned to the precinct that night, exhausted but determined. As he walked through the quiet hallways, he passed Emily and Kevin, who were still poring over case files. "You two should go home," Nate said. "We will," Emily replied, smiling faintly. "But not yet." Nate continued to his office, where he sat alone, staring at the photo of his family on his desk. The weight of the job pressed down on him, but so did the reminder of why he'd taken it in the first place. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The battle wasn't over, but he wasn't backing down. 2 days after the fire, Nate met with Vanessa Green at her brother's temporary shelter. The neighborhood was still reeling, and tensions between residents and the police were at an all-time high. Vanessa's voice was steady, but laced with exhaustion. "You promised accountability, Chief. Where's the justice for my brother?" "We're closing in on the people responsible," Nate assured her. "But this isn't just about finding the culprits. We have to stop the culture that led to this." "Stop the culture?" Vanessa scoffed. "You can't even stop your own officers from turning on you. How are you supposed to change this town?" The words stung, but Nate didn't flinch. "One step at a time, and this is a step we're going to take together." Vanessa gave him a long, appraising look before nodding. "You better mean that, Chief, because if you fail, we all do." Back at the precinct, Nate's investigation into the fire revealed deeper cracks in the department. A tip from Emily Harrington led to a shocking discovery. Officer Tom Ridley had been in contact with Derek Fuller multiple times since his termination. Nate called Ridley into his office. "Tom, I need you to explain these calls to Fuller," Nate said, sliding a report across the desk. Ridley's face darkened. "I'm not the only one talking to him, Chief. He's got friends everywhere, and you know it." "That's not an excuse," Nate replied, his tone firm. "Your loyalty belongs to this department, not a disgraced ex-officer." Ridley shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Nate dismissed him with a warning, knowing this was just the tip of the iceberg. Word of Fuller's influence spread quickly, sparking outrage in the community. A protest outside the precinct drew hundreds of residents, many holding signs demanding justice for Vanessa's brother. Nate stepped outside to address the crowd, flanked by Emily Harrington and Kevin Moore. The air buzzed with tension, but Nate kept his voice steady. "I hear you," he began. "I hear your anger, your frustration, and your fear. And I want you to know we're working to root out the problems that have plagued this department for too long." A voice from the crowd shouted. When will we see results?" Nate paused before responding. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But I promise you this. I'm not going anywhere until this department earns your trust." Vanessa, standing near the front, gave him a slight nod. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. Inside the precinct, the tension reached a boiling point. Rebecca Grant and a group of officers openly challenged Nate's leadership during a briefing. "This department is falling apart," Grant said, her voice sharp. "You've got officers resigning, community members protesting, and a staff that's afraid to do their jobs." Nate let her words hang in the air before responding. "You're right," he said. This department is falling apart because the foundation it was built on was rotten. But we're rebuilding it brick by brick. And if you're not ready to be part of that, you're free to leave." The room fell silent. Grant's face reddened, but she said nothing more. Emily and Kevin's investigation into the arson case uncovered a key piece of evidence: surveillance footage showing Tom Ridley's car near the scene of the fire. When confronted, Ridley broke down, admitting that he had given fuller information about Vanessa's brother's address. "I didn't know he'd take it this far," Ridley said, his voice shaking. "You knew enough to know it was wrong," Nate replied. "You're suspended, effective immediately." The news sent shockwaves through the precinct. For many officers, Ridley's actions were a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how deep the problems ran. The arrest of Ridley and Fuller's associate marked a turning point for the department. At a town hall meeting, Nate addressed the community alongside Vanessa Green. "These arrests are not the end of the story," Nate said. "They're the beginning of a new chapter, one where accountability is not just a word, but a practice." Vanessa spoke next, her tone firm but hopeful. "We've seen what happens when a community is ignored. But now, we're starting to see what happens when it's heard." The crowd erupted in applause, a moment of unity in a town still healing. The following week, Nate organized a community event at Cedar Valley Park, inviting residents and officers to come together in a neutral space. At first, the atmosphere was tense, with groups keeping their distance. But as the evening wore on, barriers began to break down. Officers played basketball with local kids, while Vanessa and Emily led a discussion about improving police-community relations. Nate watched from the sidelines, a rare smile on his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the event wound down, Nate stood by the park's edge, watching the lights of Cedar Valley twinkle in the distance. Emily Harrington approached, her face lit by the glow of the street lamps. "We've still got a long way to go," she said. "I know," Nate replied, "but we're moving in the right direction." For the first time since his arrival, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, if only slightly. The battle was far from over, but the tide was starting to turn. The weeks following the arrests of Derek Fuller and Tom Ridley marked a noticeable shift in Cedar Valley. At the precinct, there was an uneasy calm as officers processed the fallout. Some quietly expressed relief that the toxic influences were being addressed, while others were still resistant, unsure what Nate Carter's vision for the department truly meant for their futures. The community, however, was starting to show signs of cautious optimism. Nate began hosting regular town halls, with Vanessa Green as a co-host, ensuring that residents had a voice in shaping the changes they wanted to see in law enforcement. "I can't change what's happened in the past," Nate told a packed audience at Cedar Valley High School. "But I can promise you that this department is committed to doing better every day, and that starts with listening." Vanessa stood beside him and added, "Accountability isn't just about the officers. It's about us as a community holding each other accountable too. This isn't their department, it's ours." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. Progress, Nate knew, would come in increments. Back at the precinct, Nate continued his push for reform. Weekly meetings focused on training and education. Officers were required to complete courses on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics. Some grumbled, but others, like Emily Harrington and Kevin Moore, embraced the opportunity to grow. Emily approached Nate after a particularly heated session. "Chief, do you really think all this training will change anything?" she asked. "It's not about changing everyone overnight," Nate replied. "It's about giving people the tools to be better and holding them accountable if they're not." Meanwhile, Nate introduced a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with newer recruits to foster collaboration and break down silos within the department. The program was met with mixed reactions, but when Nate personally joined the program as a mentor, it sent a powerful message about his commitment. One Friday evening, Nate joined Emily and Kevin on a foot patrol through the West Cedar neighborhood. The streets were quieter than usual, but there was still an air of tension. At one house, a woman stepped outside with her young son. "Officer Harrington," she called, waving Emily over. "Yes, ma'am," Emily responded, approaching with a smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said. Jaden's been talking about how you stopped to play basketball with him last week. It's been a long time since he said anything good about the police. Emily's smile widened, and she glanced back at Nate. That's what we're here for, she said. Nate felt a rare moment of pride. It was a small victory, but one that showed real progress. Just as things seemed to stabilize, a new challenge emerged. A high-profile incident in a neighboring town involving police misconduct brought national attention to the region. Protests erupted, and Cedar Valley wasn't spared from the ripple effects. Nate was called to a meeting with the mayor, who was under pressure to ensure Cedar Valley didn't become the next flashpoint. "What's your plan, Chief?" the mayor asked, his tone sharp. "This town can't afford bad press." "My plan," Nate said, "is the same as it's always been: transparency, accountability, and communication. We've been building trust with the community, and now is the time to show them we're serious." Nate mobilized his officers to engage with protesters rather than confront them. They handed out water, listened to grievances, and ensured everyone remained safe. When Vanessa Green took the megaphone to address the crowd, she commended the department's approach. "This is what policing should look like," she said. "Protecting people, not silencing them." The protest ended peacefully, a stark contrast to the violent scene in other towns. The peaceful resolution to the protest brought unexpected praise for Nate and the department. Local news outlets highlighted the event as an example of how law enforcement and communities could work together. Nate's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, some congratulatory, others still skeptical. One message stood out, a short note from Malik Reynolds. "You're making progress, Chief. Don't stop now." At the precinct, Nate's zero-tolerance policy for misconduct continued to be tested. A minor incident involving an officer's rude treatment of a civilian reached Nate's desk. The officer, a relatively new recruit, apologized profusely, but Nate didn't let the matter slide. "We're building trust, one interaction at a time," Nate told the officer. "This isn't just about you, it's about the department. Make it right." The officer, under Nate's guidance, wrote a letter of apology to the civilian and volunteered to join the community outreach team. It was another small step, but one that reinforced the new culture Nate was trying to establish. By the end of Nate's first year as chief, the Cedar Valley Police Department was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. The department had implemented new policies, and officers like Emily and Kevin had become champions of change. During a staff meeting, Captain Brennan, once a skeptic, stood to address the team. "I've seen a lot of chiefs come through here," Brennan said, "but I've never seen one make this much of a difference. Chief Carter's shown us what leadership looks like. Now it's up to us to carry it forward." The room erupted in applause, and Nate felt a rare swell of emotion. The road ahead was still long, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. Nate attended a community fair later that month, where officers mingled with residents in a way that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Families approached officers with smiles instead of suspicion, and children played games organized by the department's outreach team. At one point, a young boy approached Nate, clutching a small notebook. "Are you the police chief?" the boy asked shyly. "I am," Nate said, kneeling to meet his gaze. "My mom says the police don't care about us," the boy said. "Is that true?" Nate placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're working hard to prove her wrong," he said gently. "And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with wonder. As the fair wound down, Nate stood at the edge of the park, watching officers and residents laugh and talk like old friends. Emily Harrington joined him, her expression one of quiet pride. "You did it, Chief," she said. "No, not terrible. We did it, and we're just getting started." The lights of Cedar Valley twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the work still to be done. But for the first time, Nate felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. Together, they were building something better one step at a time. Nate's first anniversary as Cedar Valley's police chief coincided with the unveiling of a new community policing center, a project he had championed from the start. Located in the heart of a neighborhood historically at odds with law enforcement, the center was designed to serve as a bridge between the precinct and the people it served. The grand opening drew a mix of attendees. Families curious about the initiative, local leaders eager to see progress, and skeptical residents who were cautiously observing from the sidelines. Nate stood at the podium, flanked by officers like Emily Harrington and Kevin Moore, as well as Vanessa Green, who had become an unofficial voice of the community. "This center represents more than just a building," Nate said, addressing the crowd. "It represents a commitment to transparency, to collaboration, and to justice. This is a space where we listen, learn, and work together to build a safer, stronger Cedar Valley." The applause started slowly but grew as Vanessa stepped forward to cut the ceremonial ribbon. As the crowd dispersed into the building, Nate caught sight of a young girl tugging at her mother's hand, pointing toward the officers handing out school supplies inside. It was a small moment, but one that reaffirmed why the work mattered. Nate's reforms hadn't gone unnoticed by the regional police union, which had grown increasingly critical of his leadership. Rumors of a vote of no confidence circulated among the ranks, pushed by officers who resented the new standards. The precinct union representative, Michael Parks, requested a meeting with Nate. Parks was an imposing man, with a reputation for being tough but fair. "You've been a lot of waves, Chief," Parks began, settling into the chair across from Nate's desk. "Waves were necessary," Nate replied, leaning back slightly. "The department wasn't functioning the way it should. I won't argue that things needed to change," Parks said, "but some officers feel like the pendulum swung too far. Morale is low, and they're worried about job security." "Morale isn't low because of accountability," Nate said firmly. "It's low because some people are afraid of being held responsible for their actions. The majority of this department wants to do the right thing, and I'm here to support them." Parks studied Nate for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough, but I'd be lying if I said there won't be pushback. Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready since day one," Nate replied. The conversation ended without a definitive resolution, but Nate knew it was a step toward understanding, if not outright agreement. The arson case involving Vanessa Green's brother reached a resolution when Derek Fuller's associate pleaded guilty to charges of vandalism and endangerment. Fuller, though not directly implicated in the act, faced additional charges for his role in inciting the attack. When the verdict was announced, Vanessa called Nate. "I didn't think I'd ever see justice for my brother," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Thank you, Chief." "It wasn't just me," Nate said. "It was the community, the department, and people like you who refused to give up." The case's conclusion marked a turning point for the precinct's reputation. Local media outlets praised the department's handling of the investigation, noting the stark contrast to its past inaction. Not everyone was ready to stay on the path Nate had forged. Rebecca Grant, once a vocal critic of Nate's leadership, submitted her resignation. "I've been with this department for 15 years, Grant said during her exit interview. "And I can't say I agree with everything you've done, but I respect that you stood by your principles." "Thank you for your service, Rebecca," Nate said. "I wish you all the best." As Grant left, Nate felt a pang of regret. Losing experienced officers was never easy, but he knew that true reform meant not everyone would stay. With the most resistant voices gone, the department began to feel more cohesive. Younger officers like Emily Harrington and Kevin Moore stepped into leadership roles, mentoring new recruits and advocating for the changes Nate had implemented. One afternoon, Nate called Emily into his office. "Emily, I've been watching how you've handled yourself over the past year," he said. "You've become a real leader in this department, and I want to offer you the role of community liaison officer." Emily's eyes widened. "Chief, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Nate said with a smile. "You've earned it." Emily accepted, and the appointment was met with widespread support, a sign that the department was finally embracing the new culture. The precinct held its annual awards ceremony at the end of the year, an event that in previous years had been little more than a formality. This time it felt different. The awards were less about tenure and more about contributions to the department and the community. Vanessa Green was invited as a guest speaker. "I've been one of the department's harshest critics," she said, addressing the room. "But tonight, I can honestly say I see hope. Hope that this department is becoming what it always should have been, a force for good." The room erupted in applause, and Nate felt a rare sense of pride. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, he felt like they were on solid ground. Late that night, Nate stood alone in his office, looking out at the quiet streets of Cedar Valley. The precinct was far from perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on what they'd accomplished. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily, holding a stack of reports. "Chief, I thought you might want to see these," she said, setting them on his desk. Nate glanced at the top report, a survey showing increased trust in the police department among Cedar Valley residents. "Thank you, Emily," he said, setting the paper aside. As she left, Nate leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The road ahead was long, but they were moving forward together. The crisp air of early spring carried the scent of blooming wildflowers as Nate Carter walked through Cedar Valley's downtown square. It was Saturday morning, and the town bustled with life. Children chased each other across the park, couples strolled hand in hand, and vendors called out to passers-by from makeshift booths. Nate had traded his uniform for casual attire, his badge tucked away for the day. This wasn't an official patrol. It was a chance to see his town as it was unfiltered, without the weight of authority coloring every interaction. As he passed a bakery, the owner, a middle-aged woman with flour-streaked hands, waved at him. "Morning, Chief Carter," she called out. "Morning, Mrs. Delaney," Nate replied with a warm smile. These exchanges had become common over the past year. Where there had once been suspicion and distance, there was now familiarity, perhaps even trust. Nate made his way to the park, where a group of kids were playing basketball on a freshly painted court. He recognized one of them, Jaden, the boy who had once asked if the police cared about his family. Jaden saw Nate and paused, dribbling the ball with one hand as he waved. "Hey, Chief." "Hey, Jaden," Nate replied, walking over. "Looking sharp out there. You've been practicing?" Jaden grinned. "Every day." Nate leaned down, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Let me know when you're ready to take on the big leagues." Jaden laughed and returned to the game, his confidence unmistakable. As Nate stood watching, Vanessa Green approached, holding a cup of coffee. "You're becoming a local celebrity," she teased. "Hardly," Nate replied. "But it's nice to see smiles out here. Feels like we've come a long way." Vanessa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We have, but there's still work to do." "There always will be," Nate said. "That's the nature of change. It's a process, not a destination." Vanessa sipped her coffee, studying him. "You ever think about what brought you here, Chief? Why you took this job?" "All the time," Nate admitted. "I came here because I wanted to make a difference. And some days I think we've done that. Other days, it feels like we're just scratching the surface." "But you stayed," Vanessa pointed out. "I stayed because of people like you," Nate said. "Because this town is worth fighting for." Later that afternoon, Nate attended a meeting at the new community center. The room was filled with residents, officers, and local leaders, all gathered to discuss the department's progress and next steps. Emily Harrington, now the community liaison officer, led the presentation. She highlighted initiatives like youth mentorship programs, de-escalation training, and new outreach efforts. "We've made a lot of progress," Emily said, "but none of it would have been possible without the support of this community and the leadership of Chief Carter." The room erupted in applause, and Nate felt a wave of humility wash over him. He wasn't one for accolades, but hearing the acknowledgement from his team and the community meant more than he could say. When it was his turn to speak, Nate kept it brief. "This isn't my victory," he said. "It's ours. And it's not the end, it's just the beginning." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nate returned to the precinct. The building was quiet, most of the officers having left for the day. He walked through the halls, the memories of the past year playing in his mind, the resistance, the breakthroughs, the moments of doubt, and the small victories that kept him going. In his office, Nate sat at his desk and opened his journal, a habit he'd picked up during his first days as chief. He wrote a single line: "Change takes time, but every step forward is worth it." Closing the journal, he leaned back in his chair, a rare moment of peace settling over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Nate felt ready to face whatever came next, not alone, but with a department and a community willing to walk the path of change together. If you enjoyed this story of perseverance, community, and change, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring narratives just like this one. Let us know in the comments what you think about Chief Carter's journey and how we can continue to tell stories that inspire hope and accountability. And remember, the road to change might be long, but together, every step forward counts.